Devin Hester and Steve McMichael are officially Pro Football Hall of Famers. It's overdue, really, for both of them. So let's make sure we properly remember and celebrate their legendary careers.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lauren Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on all of your favorite social media platforms, including the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, where you can keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use our promo code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. On the show today, we look back over the now Hall of Fame careers of Devin Hester, Steve McMichael, and we'll make some time for Julius Peppers as well, who I think counts as a Chicago Bears Hall of Famer for the 4 years he spent with this organization. We'll be joined by Larry D from Bears Talk Underground, who's really great on Bears history, and he's got a great I wouldn't say photographic memory, but encyclopedic memory of recent and past Bears history. So we're going to talk about some of our favorite Devin Hester moments, how we remember Steve McMichael on that 85 Bears team, and what kind of separated him from some of the other great players on that defense, and Julius Peppers' impact as well on those 2010s Bears. And I also want to get into, with Larry, who else? Who's next? Which former Chicago Bears players that aren't in the Hall of Fame still deserve to get in now that Devin Hester and Steve McMichael are in there? There's a lot of reminiscence, so take a trip down memory lane with us on the podcast today. All right, joining us now on the Locked On Bears podcast is Larry D, host of the Bears Talk Underground podcast. You can follow him on Twitter at BTU_Larry, and you can find Bears Talk Underground anywhere you get your podcasts. Larry, thanks so much for joining us today, and let me start with this. Did you think Devin Hester would make it into the Hall of Fame eventually? Are you surprised he got in this year? What was sort of your reaction to the news, even as it kind of came out early?
For me, it was always because he's primarily a special teams guy, and we know that it is near impossible for a primarily special teams player to make it in there. I mean, there's maybe one or two kickers, like one kicker and one punter. Like Ray Guy is the only punter in the NFL Hall of Fame. I thought that if he didn't get in on the first ballot, that he would have to be like Mongo, waiting until now as a senior finalist to finally get in. Kind of through the back door, if you will. The fact that he has made it now on the third try, I am actually surprised that he's in because of all the competition that he faced after his first ballot opportunity.
Yeah, I'm kind of the same way. I think we both strongly believed he deserved to be in the Hall of Fame, but it's a different
100%.
conversation between I would have put him in first ballot, but once he's not in first ballot, then you look at all of the other players that become eligible each year, and it's sure, if the pool never grew, he would get in quickly, but every year another really good crop of players ultimately adds to that list of guys who should be first ballot this year. And at least I think the Hall of Fame committee, or the voting here, has been consistent in okay, first ballot is reserved for guys that are maybe a little bit something above and beyond the upper echelon of Hall of Fame. And I think you can make an argument for Devin Hester in that group as well, but the fact that he at least gets in and doesn't have to wait to be a senior addition like Mongo is definitely a welcomed sight. What do you think about McMichael getting in now? I mean, certainly it's heartwarming when it comes to what he's dealing with ALS and this stage of his life. I mean, it seems to me I don't know, it's hard to feel like it's storybook because he's not going to be able to partake in the same sort of celebrations, festivities, but at the same time, glad he's still alive for it. I mean, how do you sort of weigh that?
To me, it's bittersweet is what it is. He deserved to be in. I mean, he wasn't somebody that was big on stats, even though I think he's still second or third all time in the franchise with sacks, which most people would probably be surprised to hear is that he's up there that high and everything. He was always one of the biggest characters that the Bears ever had on the field, off the field, post career, and everything. So it's wonderful that he's finally in, because you can't imagine the 85 Bears being the 85 Bears without Steve McMichael. And, it was just an a once in a lifetime defense in 85. And he was a huge, huge part of that. So it's bittersweet that he's making it in. It's great that he lived long enough to see it, especially with the shape that he's in. So I hope that he can finally be at peace now, knowing that he got the biggest accolade he deserved.
I'm definitely gonna have to rely on you for Steve McMichael memories that I was not alive for. We'll get into that in a little bit. Real quick though, Julius Peppers, the other player who maybe isn't going in quote unquote as a Chicago Bear, but
Right.
4 memorable seasons with the Bears. Obviously, a lot longer with the Carolina Panthers, also a little bit with the Green Bay Packers. I don't know how much do you feel like this franchise can claim some small stake in Peppers, or do you not really? I mean, we remember his time with the Bears, but he's not really going to be remembered as a Bear, or is 4 years enough to feel like, okay, we were an important enough part of his journey?
Well, the funny thing is, I think that he can still be counted as a member of the Bears in the Hall of Fame, because if I'm not mistaken, the Bears count Alan Page as a Hall of Famer of theirs, because Alan Page played for the Bears, like I think 3-4 years at the end of his career, after he made his Hall of Fame resume with the Purple People Eaters in Minnesota. So it very well might be one that the Bears can chalk up as one of their own. But he's definitely, as far as like, when you think of Julius Peppers, you think of him being with the Carolina Panthers. Not a bad consolation prize for the Carolina Panthers, because in 2001, the Panthers went 1-15. They won the first game of the year, lost 15 straight. And obviously you think that lines them up for the number 1 pick in the draft. Well, unfortunately, in 2002, that's when the Houston Texans joined the NFL. So they got the number 1 pick. So not a bad consolation prize to get a Hall of Famer when David Carr was anything but for the Texans.
As long as Peppers and Mongo don't go in as Green Bay Packers, I think that's all it's going to be.
Yeah, that's no bueno right there.
This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by Robinhood. Did you know that even if you have a 401k for retirement, you can also still have an IRA? Robinhood has the only IRA that gives you a 3% boost on every dollar you contribute when you subscribe to Robinhood Gold. But get this, now through April 30th, Robinhood is even boosting every single dollar you transfer in from other retirement accounts with a 3% match. That's right, no cap on the 3% match. Robinhood Gold gets you the most for your retirement thanks to their IRA with a 3% match. This offer is good through April 30th. Get started at robinhood.com/boost. Subscription fees apply. And now for some legal info. Claim as of Q1 2024, validated by Radius Global Market Research. Investing involves risk, including loss. Limitations apply to IRAs and 401ks. 3% match requires Robinhood Gold for 1 year from the date of first 3% match. Must keep Robinhood IRA for 5 years. The 3% matching on transfers is subject to specific terms and conditions. Robinhood IRA available to U.S. customers in good standing. Robinhood Financial LLC, member SIPC, is a registered broker-dealer. Well, let's go back through some of these Hall of Fame careers. Let's start with Mongo, since we'll go sort of older in chronological order. Like, I was not alive for any of his playing career. I don't mean to date myself or make you sound old by comparison, but I know you were. You were a young pup back in Mondo.
I was
playing days. I was watching through some highlight film of him in some of those 80s defensive lines, and like, I don't know if it's the single with the crossbar helmet with the vertical bar and the single bar there that just makes him look so like tough and old school, but it's just like he would leave this path of like bodies, blockers would be like flailing to try and stay on him, and there would just be this you could like look behind him on his way to the quarterback. There was just people laying on both sides, and it was just like a path of destruction that I don't feel like I've been able to properly appreciate, because he's not the first or second name that comes to my mind when I think 85 Bears defense.
Right. But like I said, he was so integral to that team and their success. When I think of Mongo, especially in his playing days, he wasn't an especially like muscular. It wasn't really you didn't really see a lot of muscles back then, but he was stocky. He was one of those guys that just felt like a load to try and move, even though he wasn't very tall, or only weighed about 270 pounds, which is light in today's NFL, especially for an interior defensive lineman. But he was just a force of nature, man. In and out, he was always on the field. Probably playing hurt, knowing the NFL back in those days. But when I think of him, of the guys like him and Dan Hampton, what I think of is the AstroTurf burns from the old Soldier Field surface that they played on, especially back in 85 and 86, was they always had those ugly red burns on their arms because, of course, they played bare-armed instead of covering up to protect their elbows and forearms from that, terrible carpet the Bears used to play on.
What do you think sort of differentiates him from the other guys on that 85 Bears defense? I mean, like, they were all ferocious in their own way. I think Mike Ditka once said that McMichael was, like, did he say the meanest or the toughest player that he ever coached?
Yeah.
Like, what was his, like, distinct mark on that team?
I think the thing about Mongo, what made him so great is that he wasn't as naturally gifted as the guys around him. He wasn't as good as McMichael, or excuse me, as Singletary or Dan Hampton or Richard Dent, but he was more tenacious than all of them. This was a guy that was not going to give up, and he had a motor that never stopped, and that's what made him so great, was that he was going to keep going from the snap to the whistle, and then maybe even a little bit after that as well.
Do you think playing on that 85 defense with a number of other Hall of Famers, like, hurt his Hall of Fame resume, or, like, was part of the reason why it took him so long? I mean, I think we talk about this a lot with some of those early Green Bay Packers teams where it's like, how many members of that elite team can you put all in the Hall of Fame before
Right.
Hall of Fame itself starts to say, well, okay, these players were great, but we got to separate them somewhere. We can't put all 11 guys on that side of the ball in there. I mean, do you think that was a factor for him, or
Sure.
we reached the right number of 85 Bears in the Hall now?
Actually, ask anybody if they think Otis Wilson or Wilbur Marshall should be in the Hall of Fame for what those animals did when they were wearing Bear uniforms. And I think that we've still got a few guys left to go on that defense, just to enshrine them as a group, because they did it all together. But I do think that it may be, I don't want to say hurt, but it definitely slowed down the fact that, you had surefire Hall of Famers in Richard Dent and Dan Hampton sharing that defensive line with him, not to speak of, Singletary behind him. And even guys like Gary Fensick, he had a Hall of Fame career. He still leads the team, the franchise history in interceptions, and it's been almost 40 years since the guy retired. He's still number one on the list.
And you mentioned McMichael's size. I was looking it up. He was listed at 6'2", 270. And
Yeah.
for comparison, this past season, Mercedes Lewis was listed at 265. So, like, about 4 inches taller, but, like, we talk about, like, the size that was the big defensive tackle back then was about Mercedes Lewis's size now, running routes for the Bears, or at least this past season at tight end.
Real quick, I'm sorry. Remember that 85 team that I've had on my show a couple of times. Emery Moorhead was a tight end. He was 6'2", 220 pounds. That's a running back in today's NFL. He would be a fullback or a running back in today's NFL, not a guy up on the offensive line blocking for Walter Payton or anything like that. That would be unheard of today.
Yeah, it's amazing how much bigger and faster these players have gotten over the years, especially that's how you end up with somebody like Devin Hester being just faster than everybody else on the field. If you had to pick one Devin Hester memory for you that stands out above the rest, I mean, we're talking, a couple dozen worth of touchdowns, but it doesn't even have to always be the touchdowns. What's the moment, or if you had to put, maybe not the number one's hard to do, but a top three, or just what stands out to you at the top of the Devin Hester list?
Well, of course, the first one would be the one that kind of made his name, which was the Monday night one against the Cardinals that won the game, because that game was as bleak as it could possibly be. Grossman personally turning the ball over 6 times. We only scored on defense. We had 1 field goal and everything. The offense did nothing offensively, and Devin Hester was the one that, put it over the top. In the moment we absolutely needed it, he ran it all the way back for the touchdown. And that's when people, even though I think he had 1 or 2 returns up to that point, that was the one where it was like, maybe we should keep an eye on this kid. And the other one that jumps out to me is the Vikings game in 2007, where it was basically like Devin Hester versus Adrian Peterson. And there was one where he caught it over his shoulder. He's looking back and running away from the ball, catches it over the shoulder, literally splits between like 3 guys, and then he's off to the races for the touchdown. And then for an encore, he caught an 80-yard touchdown pass from Brian Griese to almost send it to overtime, because Adrian Peterson almost ran it back for a touchdown, and they kicked the 55-yarder with 0 time left to win that game. So,
yeah, too many of those Devin Hester memories end with but unfortunately this happened and they lost.
Yeah.
the one that jumps to mind right away, and I know you didn't like intentionally not mention it, but I think you knew it'd be mine anyway. The opening of the Super Bowl was like the Devin Hester Hall of Fame thing for me is I don't want to say personal, but like it hits home for me because like that 2006 season, his rookie year, was really when I fell in love with the sport of football and the Chicago Bears, and it was really led by that explosive freak of nature returning those kicks for a touchdown. And like that's how I fell in love. And like I would not be here today talking to you on this podcast if not for Devin Hester doing what he did in that 2006 season. And then when he took that opening kick back for the Super Bowl, 10-year-old Lauren, I hate to admit, 10-year-old Lauren was convinced that the Chicago Bears were winning that Super Bowl, and that being a Bears fan would be the greatest thing. I mean, it was all going to be great from there. That was the beginning of the long-term success for the franchise. You win one Super Bowl, and then with that defense, you could win 2 or 3 down the line. I mean, things were never going to be down there hill from there. Like that was the peak. Like we were going to be for years and years and years.
And the very next season in 2007 is when the Bears Talk Underground was born. And we haven't been back to the Super Bowl since. So if it's my fault, I'm sorry. I apologize wholeheartedly that 17 seasons in, we haven't made it back to the Super Bowl yet.
When I think back about Devin Hester's career, I mean, obviously the return touchdowns are the reason he's in the Hall of Fame, not just the return touchdowns, but also just like the impact on the Chicago Bears team. Like there was this feeling like even when the other team scored, like you knew at least after they scored, they would have to give the ball back to Devin Hester. I mean, they could try and take away from him or kick it out of bounds or whatever, but like he was in some ways a weapon you could not avoid, because even if you weren't kicking it to him and you were trying not to kick it to him, it would become a weapon still for the offense and for the Bears in terms of field position by either kicking it off out of bounds or trying to angle the punt away from him or angle the punt short so he didn't have a chance to return. Like no matter what, you either had to get it to him or automatically grant the Chicago Bears field position. And that level of an ability to dictate what the opponent did and change the game to me is like what made him a Hall of Famer.
Because you had to game plan him. I mean, special teams was as important as it possibly could be when you were playing the Chicago Bears, because you had a one of one in Devin Hester that could do absolutely anything from anywhere on the field. So it's not like, oh, if you get him in the midfield, it's trouble. It didn't matter if there was 30 yards between him and the next guy, or if there were 5 guys bearing down on him, he was going to be able to hurt you no matter what. So you had to figure out what you were going to do. Do we want to get up there? Do we want extra hang time so the guys can get there and impact him? Or do we want these short kicks so that we can spread out and, clog up all the lanes for him to run into? You had to spend not just a few moments or a phase, you had to spend actual huge chunks of practice preparing for this minute part of the game plan, or at least the minute part of the game. It's maybe 4 or 5 plays in a game that you have to count for, but Devin Hester could hurt you with all 5 if you let him. So you had to have that on lock before you can move on with the rest of your day, because Devin Hester could blow a game wide open. I mean, the first one that comes to mind for me, number one, is that game against St. Louis on Monday night in 2006, where he ran 2 kicks back for a touchdown. And then a year later, he did the same thing against Denver. That the Bears were in that game because Devin Hester ran 2 touchdowns back or 2 kicks back for a touchdown. He was that kind of game wrecker from whenever he returned the ball.
This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by Nissan. Are you the kind of driver that likes to push things a little further? Ever wonder what adventure could be around the next corner? Well, our friends at Nissan have a lineup of SUVs with the capabilities to take your adventure to the next level. How about the 2024 Nissan Rogue? It's perfect for city drives and great escapes. I actually rented a new Nissan Rogue when I was down in Mobile for the Senior Bowl a couple weeks ago, and I really loved driving it around. Super convenient, connects right with your phone. It sits up high. It's a fast, convenient drive. It has a little get up and go as well. It's just comfortable, cool, calm, collected. It's got everything you're looking for in a vehicle. Nissan's incredible lineup also includes the 2024 Pathfinder and the 2024 Nissan Armada that can change really what you would expect from a full-size SUV. Picture a rugged 4x4 that can seat up to 8 in first-class luxury and style. Take the Nissan Rogue, Nissan Pathfinder, or Nissan Armada and go find your next big adventure. Shop nissanusa.com. Locked On Bears is also brought to you by our friends at Prize Picks. The big game is right around the corner, and Prize Picks is the easiest and most exciting way to turn every game-changing moment into 100 times your money. With as little as 4 correct picks, you can turn $10 into $1,000. Prize Picks sets a projection for every player in the game, and you pick whether they perform better or worse than that Prize Picks projection. And they've got a special prize pick for this game with Patrick Mahomes just needs to throw more than 1 yard in the big game, and you can win on Prize Picks. You pair that up with 3 other picks, and you're going to get 100 times your money just by getting your picks right on Sunday. It's a lot of fun, and it's a great way to have some extra stakes involved in the game. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use our promo code LockedOnNFL for a first deposit match up to $100. And don't forget, if Patrick Mahomes throws for more than 1 yard in the big game, you win on Prize Picks. It's prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL. Another Hall of Famer in an era of Chicago Bears football that we don't think of being loaded with Hall of Famers, but now you got Devin Hester, you've got Brian Urlacher from that era as well. I mean, Julius Peppers was technically part of that. A portion of that Chicago Bears era, not as much overlap with Devin Hester. I guess Hester was there for three of the Julius Peppers years towards the end there, but I don't know. How do you sort of think about the Julius Peppers age of the Bears defense? I remember him being kind of like the mercenary. It was like, okay, this was going to be the missing piece for this defensive line to put that defense over the top and get this team back to the Super Bowl. And I guess he helped get them back to the NFC Championship game, but then that was kind of as far as it went.
Yeah, unfortunately, that was also a time where we sold the farm to get Jay Cutler and then didn't give him any weapons until it was almost too late, because we didn't get him Brandon Marshall until 3 or 4 years later. So, I mean, all due respect to Devin Hester, when he's your number one receiver, you've got some work to do on the offensive side of the ball, and Matt Forte couldn't do it all by himself. And God love Desmond Clark and everything that he could do, but he wasn't a Travis Kelce or an Antonio Gates or anything like that. So if you stop these 1-2 guys, it was an unfortunate time period right there, because the Bears were really good. They were always seemed to be 1 or 2 players away, but they could never find those guys that pushed them over the top. And Julius Peppers was definitely one of those guys that you thought could make a difference. And in 2010, that was an all-pro season for him. That was the year he signed that, record-breaking contract to join the team. And he was otherworldly in that first season. And I talk so much on the podcast, I remember this vividly, about how he was doing things that you will not find on the stat sheet. He took up 3 guys to left, Briggs and Urlacher wide open, to come in and make a tackle or something to that effect. It was so much that he was doing, or how disruptive he was, especially in the running game, where he could just slant across like 2 offensive linemen's face and be in the backfield before anybody laid a finger on him. It was unbelievable watching him in 2010.
Yeah, you make a great point. Like, I was just looking back in that 2010 season, he was in the I think he finished 4th in defensive player of the year voting. He was all pro bowler. He had 8 sacks. That's not a defensive all pro Bowl necessarily type stat line alone, but you throw in the forced fumbles, the pass breakups, he had a couple of interceptions, a bunch of tackles for loss, a bunch of quarterback hits. And then you mentioned like all the different things he did in the dirty work. Like, it feels like he was a player that we didn't have a great way to fully measure how big his impact was, but I think you saw it in like the elevation of the level of play of everyone else around him in the defense, and then him still, in spite of like all the double and triple teams he got, still getting 8 sacks on top of that.
Yeah, and because he was another one of those guys to go along with Briggs and Urlacher, where you always have to know where he is on the field, because the Bears like to move him around. He wasn't just a defensive end. Sometimes they put him up in the middle, right over the center, and things like that, because he was big enough to be able to handle it. So it was just another thing where it's like, that's quarterback's got to find all 3 of those guys and, contend with Chris Harris and Peanut Tillman and, the other guys that were, in the secondary of that football team.
Well, since you mentioned Lance Briggs, you mentioned Peanut Tillman, who else do you think that's not in the current Hall of Fame as far as former Chicago Bears belongs in? I am a big believer that Charles Tillman, the peanut punch, still gets talked about. That's what we call those forced fumbles. There's not great historical records for forced fumbles in that way, but all the interceptions, all the forced fumbles, to me, makes Charles Tillman a future Hall of Famer. I struggle with Lance Briggs a little bit just because there's so many great linebackers and like he was very, 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 very good and he's an all-time Chicago Bear, but is he a Hall of Fame player? I mean, I'm not saying he doesn't belong in the Hall of Fame, but I'm not as like upset that Lance Briggs isn't in the Hall of Fame just yet. I guess, first of all, where do you land on those two? And are there other names from recent or longer term Bears history that you think need to be in the Hall?
Well, you want to talk about a guy that was hurt by the guy he was playing next to. That's definitely Lance Briggs. Because if he wasn't playing side by side with a first ballot Hall of Famer and Brian Urlacher for the entirety of his career, because Urlacher was there just a little bit before, and I think he only played maybe 1 or 2 seasons without Urlacher. And those were not really great seasons for the Bears or the Bears defense, specifically 2013, 2014. Those were terrible years under Mel Tucker on defense, during the Trestman years. But talk about a guy who made the Pro Bowls or should have probably made more, but he was hurt by the fact that he was technically an outside linebacker when most outside linebackers were now edge rushers. We were still transitioning to those actually being different positions. So he was being hurt by outside linebackers who were pass rushers getting sacks and making more of a statistical impact than Briggs got to make. And when you have a move named after you, I think that means that you were an all-time kind of player. And even though he had to wait 12 seasons, I think, to make his first Pro Bowl, Peanut Tillman was a very, very underrated guy throughout the great majority of his career. He was always one of the best corners in the league during his entire career.
It feels like he's almost like remembered more fondly than we thought, not we, but than he was nationally thought of at the time. Like I remember there was this perception for Tillman that like, oh, he's just a cover 2 corner. He's just a zone corner. Like those guys aren't as good or aren't as valuable as like the Darrelle Revis. I mean, at the time where it's just Revis Island, you put him one-on-one in man coverage and he was going to lock everyone down. But Charles Tillman played in that Lovie Smith Tampa 2 defense. So he's not as good or not being asked to do the same things when, I mean, he was still playing man coverage plenty in those games too. Like it felt like a false narrative at the time for Tillman that in hindsight, I think nationally the NFL media and larger, retrospect, like understands that no, he was actually better than we gave him credit for at the time. And I guess that leaves me optimistic that he could get in the Hall. But at the same time, like we talked about with Devin, every year really good players get added to the list. And you wonder, like, is he going to have that year where he can sneak in, or are there always going to be better players ahead of him?
Well, go and ask a guy like Megatron, Calvin Johnson, who was the guy that he liked to play against the least, and he will tell you that it was Charles Tillman, because that was a guy that basically disappeared from the stat sheet when he played the Bears twice a year. Megatron would make a play here and there, but he wouldn't take over a football game like he would when he wasn't playing against Charles Tillman. So, that was the best wide receiver of that particular era, and Peanut had him shut down. And even though he wasn't the quote unquote shutdown corner, when Peanut was on Megatron, we had a 50-50 shot of slowing that guy down. And that was as good as anybody could do against him in those days.
Do you think Olin Kreutz can make it into the Hall of Fame? 6 straight Pro Bowls, I think, but it's hard with offensive linemen. Like it's a reputation thing. And I think he had that in Chicago. Does he have that reputation nationally?
I think he does, because part of the Pro Bowl voting is the players. So, I mean, that's only a third of it, but it's like, I think Olin had the respect around the league. If you're talking about a guy that we can talk about 10, 15 years from now being voted in as a senior, that's definitely a guy that I think gets in around that point, when he's not trying to wrestle his way through, the class, like the Ray Lewises and things like that, to try to get through and make the Hall of Fame on a regular ballot. I definitely think he's somebody that probably 10 years from now, 15 years from now, when his eligibility is up, that gets in as a senior for sure. I think so.
Let me throw 2 names at you quick, and then we'll get out of here of players you might not immediately associate as Chicago Bears, but you might not immediately associate as Hall of Famers. But that's because they're on the fence for me. But they're guys that would make count as Chicago Bears Hall of Famers. Greg Olsen, Brandon Marshall,
for sure.
Do you think they're both Hall of Famers? I mean,
Brandon Marshall, yes. Greg Olsen, I don't know.
Yeah, because
Greg Olsen.
Greg had 3 1,000-yard seasons, but I'll finish his career with over 8,500 yards and 60 touchdowns. Like but only 3 Pro Bowls. I mean, he's borderline a little bit to me.
Yeah, I agree. He would definitely be borderline. But Brandon Marshall, all the numbers are there for him. I believe, and he was good to great everywhere that he went. I think that would maybe his reputation would be the one that hurts him, since he could never really find a home in the NFL. Did he ever spend any more than 3 seasons in any place in the NFL? Because I think that was the cap for him, was like 3 years, boom, on to the next kind of thing.
Technically, he lasted 4 years in Denver the first time, but then, two in Miami, 3 in Chicago, 2 with the Jets. I forgot he was a New York Giant for a year and a Seattle Seahawk at the very end. So,
you know what? I was pulling for him when he was with the Seahawks, because as historic as his career was, he never made the playoffs, which I think would be the thing that really hurts him from getting in, was that we never got to see Brandon Marshall in the postseason.
And he never recorded a stat in a playoff game, at least.
Yeah. Because none of his teams ever made the playoffs, because 2012, 13, and 14, the Bears did not make the playoffs. The years in Miami and in Denver, I think the best shot was like his rookie year, when they played San Diego, the Chargers at the time, for the division title in the last week of the season, and the Chargers beat them, so they didn't make the playoffs. I think that's as close as Brandon Marshall ever got.
It's crazy that a guy who had 1,500 yards twice and 1,000 yards for most of his career never had a shot to get in the playoffs. But I agree. I think the longevity there gets him in. Larry, you've been a Hall of Fame caliber guest with us on the podcast today. Appreciate using your longer memory of Chicago Bears than mine. Let everybody know where they can find your podcast and your other work online.
Well, you can find it anywhere that you can find your podcast, Apple, Spotify, you name it. It's Bears Talk Underground. You can find me on Instagram and on X/Twitter, whatever the kids are calling it these days, at BTU_Larry.
Great. Larry, thanks so much for joining us today, and I'm sure we'll do it again soon.
Sounds good, man.
Thanks again to Larry D from Bears Talk Underground for joining us on the podcast today. If you enjoyed our conversation, make sure you hit that subscribe button on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel or wherever you listen to the podcast. That's going to be the best way to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. I'd love to hear your favorite Devin Hester and Steve McMichael and Julius Peppers moments from their Bears career. Leave us a comment here on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, or you can tweet us at Locked On Bears. You can post in the Locked On Bears Facebook group. However you do it, just make sure you're making Locked On Bears your first listen each and every day. Coming up next week, I want to try and get to know Bears offensive coordinator Shane Waldron a little bit more, working on kind of a different style of the Locked On Bears podcast to really kind of dive deep on Shane Waldron in his own words. I'm hoping to have that ready for Monday's podcast, and going to try and get some other special guests on in the coming weeks ahead of the NFL Scouting Combine, ahead of free agency. A lot to keep breaking down for you all offseason long. So we're always going to make sure that every single day you have another opportunity to bear down.